Hey there, it's been a little while. Steve Meyer here, and you're listening to Musing Heavy, the site devoted to alternative reflections on hard rock and heavy metal. This is the beginning of a six-part series based on a paper I put together not too long ago called Sound Quality and Authenticity in Heavy Metal and Hard Rock, Implications and Controversies. Okay, so in this series, the emphasis is not going to be on, say, songs and performances per se. It's going to be on the sound and presentation of these things. Okay, so for example, when you're listening to an Anthrax album, a good thing for everyone to do, I might add, are you concentrating just on the tunes themselves, right? Or does the quality of the recording impact your overall listening experience, right? Will you listen to a rough recording of Anthrax? Will you listen to a bootleg? Can you handle that? Or is it just too rough for you that you can only listen to very pristine recordings of Anthrax, for example? All right. If you still go to live shows, let's say you just caught the latest Pantera, caught Pantera on tour. Is it important for you to know, if you're seeing Pantera live, that all the sounds they're making coming off the stage are made by the musicians at that point in time, in real time? Is that important for you to know, right? Or would you be bothered if you found out that the band was using pre-recorded tapes to enhance the live presentation? I'm not saying Pantera does that, but let's just say if that were the case, would that be a problem for you? Would that lower your estimation of the band in any way, shape, or form? Okay. These are the types of things we're going to discuss throughout this series, amongst many other fairly controversial sort of issues. All right. So you can always read the essay in its entirety if you'd rather not bother with the YouTube presentations. The links are provided below. And so let's dig in a little bit here. So, like other forms of music, especially anything outside of pop, frankly, the heavy metal and hard rock environment is populated with all kinds of folks. And again, that's what makes it so fascinating and so interesting. There are indeed people who are audiophiles, people that care immensely about sound quality, right? At the other end of the spectrum, there are people that we might refer to as audio Neanderthals, right? Or essentially people that sound does not play any role. Just give me the tunes. I don't really care how they sound. Perfectly fair if you're that type of person. There are avid collectors, right? These are folks who are probably very aware of differences in sound. They'll know albums that sound really good, albums that are produced maybe not so well, right? But they're going to try to collect them all because that's sort of what they do. They're kind of completists, right? And then there's fans who are more casual and or selective listeners. So these are people that might just have an album or two from a given band, right? Very selective. And in fact, maybe what they select are the really, really good recordings, the ones that they feel are produced really well, right? As an example. There are people who are authenticity policers, as you might refer to them. These are folks that not only get really bothered by bands that they perceive to be as not real or not authentic, but they're going to voice that opinion to as many people as they can, right? So on social media, etc. So if they find out that a band's using backing tracks while playing live, they'll get really disturbed by that, and they're going to tell all kinds of people about it, etc. Right? And again, and all kinds of folks in between as well, right? Now, such variety always provides fodder for lively debate regarding how certain heavy bands should sound and how they should be presented. Okay, of course, there is no right or wrong here, or at least I don't think there's any right or wrong here. But fan diversity with respect to how music is produced and how authentic artists are drives different parts of the music industry and also creates controversy in several interesting ways. And again, that's what we're going to look at. A little roadmap of where the series goes. So in just a second or two, I'm going to provide an overview of the characteristics of a good recording. So what are the attributes a good recording is likely to have in heavy metal and hard rock? All right. And this is sort of, we're going to talk initially about conventional recordings, classic recordings, if you like, right? And then I'm going to go on and talk about exceptions to the rule. So if this is what a typical heavy metal and hard rock recording sounds like, a very good one that people think are very good, right? Here are some exceptions to the rule. So there are recordings in heavy metal and hard rock that are kind of rough, deliberately raw, right? But can be completely appropriate for what the artist is trying to get across. Okay. And then there's other examples of recordings that maybe are too pristine, right? That are maybe produced or overproduced, perhaps, right? That have the effect of maybe taking away some of the power of heavy metal and hard rock. So we're going to talk about those issues going forward. I'm going to use contentious examples from the Black Sabbath, Dark Throne, and AC/DC catalogs to sort of get the point across. And then we're going to get into the debates surrounding in-concert augmentations and live album enhancements. Again, I'm going to talk about a lot of different bands in these sections, but I'm going to mention a lot of the controversies surrounding Kiss and their in-concert augmentations that are occurring recently. We'll contrast that with Deep Purple, a band that's actually very authentic in terms of being very real in the live environment, but there's plus and minuses to that as well. And then we're going to talk about live albums that in some cases are not really all that live. And I'll especially talk about the example of Thin Lizzy's Live and Dangerous, amongst other live albums too. And we'll talk about those controversies as well. And then we'll conclude the paper by looking at three tendencies in heavy fans, the audiophile, the purist, and collector, that I think will inevitably invoke strong opinions regarding the importance of sound quality and authenticity. In other words, if you have any of these tendencies, audiophile, purist, or collector, you're likely to care about this stuff quite a bit. If you don't have any of these tendencies, these things probably won't matter to you as much. Authenticity and sound won't be a big player, in your music habits. For you, it's more just about give me the tunes and I'm good, right? So we'll be able to categorize people a little bit at the end as well. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the conventionally good sounding heavy record. Okay, now, got to say right off the bat, how good a record sounds is certainly subjective, right? As is the appropriateness of its production or how it's been created, right? So all of this is largely ear of the beholder. But having said that, right, at least in terms of a classic or conventional recording, I believe there are certain aspects of what makes many hard rock or heavy metal albums sound good to most people, at least, right? And it has to do with transparency, tone, and soundstage, or that the instruments and voices can be heard clearly. That's transparency, right? That the presentation offers balanced levels of high, mid-range, and low frequencies. That's tone, right? And that various components of the music are arranged logically within the sound field if you're hearing in stereo. That refers to soundstage. Okay, I'm gonna build on these things a little more going forward here. While fans of heavy music will rarely respond favorably to a mix that's too laid back, so an album that's produced, very subtly and very quietly, right? Probably that's not going to work because this is very aggressive music by and large, right? So you need a mix that's actually fairly forward moving, right? But a production that sounds too shrill or maybe trebly thin can be off-putting as well, right? Most people in heavy metal and hard rock value strong bass. We do like our bass, but that can go too far too. We don't want the bass to cover up all the other instruments as well. It's not like we're walking around with a boom box and all we want to hear is bass, right? We want to hear the other instruments as well. So there's a balance needed there also, right? In heavy metal and hard rock, guitars, vocals, and drums tend to take up a lot of the sound spectrum. That's a big part of what we're hearing. Guitars, vocals, and drums. Guitars often, right? So adequate positioning is very helpful, right? That's where we need a logically arranged arranged soundstage. Okay. If everything is produced, everything's compressed and it's all in the same area, it's going to be hard to hear the differences between the guitars, the different guitar tracks, the vocals, and the drums. We like things to be spread out so that we can hear what's going on in the different instruments, right? So a well-defined soundstage is important. And more about the soundstage here. Since the mid-1970s, a typical soundstage for many hard rock and metal recordings will feature the following. And I've prepared a little diagram that maybe shows this a little better than just the text. So, okay. And it's really kind of interesting, I think. Check me on this. Next time you're listening to your tunes, notice how many of them sort of adhere to this type of soundstage schema, if you like, right? I would say about 75%, if not higher, of heavy metal and hard rock albums that have been put out since the mid-1970s will have this type of soundstage arrangement, right? Okay, so I've kind of color coded them. As you can see, I got the guitars in red, the vocals are in blue, the percussion stuff's in green, and etc. So I'll talk about each a little bit. And so let's say, now it's important that you're listening in stereo or you won't really get a soundstage. But let's say you've got a good set of headphones on and it's sort of, you'll hear the instruments all around your head kind of thing and the voices. Or you've got a two-speaker system and you're sitting right in between, so you're kind of in that sweet spot, and you may or may not have a subwoofer, doesn't matter, you'll still get a soundstage. If you have a subwoofer, it'll just sort of pull your soundstage down. Your soundstage is kind of like this rectangle, right? And if you have a subwoofer, it'll just tend to make it pull it down a little more, okay? All right, so how are the instruments arranged in a typical soundstage in a conventional heavy metal or hard rock recording? Well, the guitars, because the guitars play such a huge role, you want to kind of separate the guitars, right? So you can hear what everybody's doing. And so the rhythm guitars will almost always be panned hard left and hard right. They're kind of coming out of each speaker, almost like they're coming out in mono in a way, right? And it doesn't matter if the band has more than one guitarist. At least in studio recordings, these things will be layered, right? So you'll have different rhythm tracks. You'll have one rhythm track or maybe even a couple rhythm tracks coming out of one speaker and a couple others and one at least coming out of the other speaker, right? So the pan left and right is typically what you'll get, right? Now the rhythm might be exactly the same that's coming out of both speakers, or there might be slight variations on the riff, but the point is they're almost always panned hard left and right. Okay, that you're hearing one distinctly out of one speaker and one out of the other, right? The lead guitars can do that too. I would say the lead guitars are typically more in the center, right? So in the middle of the song, say when you got your lead break, that'll almost always, usually that'll be say around 12 o'clock kind of thing, sort of right in your face coming at you. But also, depending on, especially if you've got two lead guitarists that are sort of battling back and forth, as lots of metal bands do. Maybe the best example would be Judas Priest, or maybe Perfected by Slayer, where you've got sort of the rhythm, going back and forth leads. Those could be panned hard left and right as well, right? So you get that configuration. But I would say most lead breaks are usually more in the center, right? And then you can have any number of guitar fills that will be a little bit off center, right? So again, in heavy metal and hard rock, there can be all kinds of guitar tracks. And it's really important to have a well-defined soundstage, because with all these different guitar tracks, you want them spread out so you can hear them, right? If everything's compressed in the center, you're not going to be able to make out the different guitar layers very well at all, right? So spreading them out is really important. And most hard rock and heavy metal will be produced that way, right? Okay, so check that out next time you're listening if you don't believe me, but a lot of you probably already know that. Okay, how about the vocals? Well, no surprise. This is typical of most music. I would say 90 to 95% of your lead vocals are going to be dead center, right? Kind of halfway up and right at 12 o'clock kind of thing, So will any harmony vocals. So any vocals that are just sort of fattening up the lead vocals or trying to harmonize with them will probably be in the center as well, or maybe just offset a little bit, right? But true backing vocals will be won't be panned hard left and right, but they might be, say, at 10 and 2 o'clock. Right. So these would be backing vocals that are, maybe singing along during the choruses or some counter vocal to the leads, but those are going to be offset. Right. Again, The reason is you want to spread the vocals out because unless the singers have very different ranges, if you put them all in the center, you're not going to hear the distinct voices very well. You got to spread them out because they're going to have similar sound frequencies, right? Okay, so it kind of makes sense. We got to have this well-defined sound stage if we're going to get full effect, right? From an album that's really well produced. How about the percussion? Well, almost always. So if we talk about the bass, or sorry, the rhythm section, we'll start with the bass guitar. The bass guitar will almost always be your lowest sound, right? Especially if you have a subwoofer. The subwoofer will pull it right down. But even if you don't, the bass guitar, if it's just a two-speaker system, will sound like it's near the floor, right? And then your bass drum or your kick drum will also be down there as well, usually above the bass guitar, but also lower, right? And then when we talk about other drums and percussion, whatever drums are kind of carrying the main beat of the song, so whether it be snares or toms or whatever, or even some cymbals, they're going to be dead center, right? They'll probably be in between the kick drums, like in terms of, height, if you like. They'll be in between the kick drums and the bass guitar, and maybe the lead vocals and the lead guitar. Almost dead center, right? Kind of hitting you right in the chest kind of thing, right? Where the main beats are, right? That's pretty typical, But then other cymbals, maybe some hi-hats, especially the crash cymbals, will be panned left and right, usually over top, kind of floating over top of things. They probably won't be panned extreme like the rhythm guitars, but they'll be off center, as will other drums. So, when drummers do those left to right kind of thing, you'll hear that effect as well. So a lot of the fills will be off center as well, right? Other things, well, keyboards, kind of got those in purple here. If the keyboard is more or less just mimicking the riff, or is the riff the main riff of the song, say, it will usually be panned left and right. So it'll act kind of like a rhythm guitar, right? But if the keyboards are more for atmosphere, more those swirling kind of keys, they're going to be over top. They're going to be panned and they'll be over top. They won't be panned extremely. They'll be kind of floating over top of everything, right? And then you can have any number of other instruments that could be kind of almost anywhere. I don't know, violins or flutes or other types of percussion, etc., could be located kind of anywhere in the sound field, right? But that's pretty typical for heavy metal and hard rock in terms of the sound stage. And again, the key is you don't want things all compressed, because then we got so many voices and instruments that are in the same sound frequencies, you just don't hear things with any definition. You want them spread out, right? And good productions will almost always have that. A well-defined sound stage, which I think is really, really important. Okay. Moreover, a couple things. While discerning fans of heavy metal will want to hear everything, right? A mix that sounds overly processed or sterile, while perhaps good for certain types of prog, maybe pop, can have diminishing returns for lots of types of heavy metal and especially hard rock, right? So a balance between a perfectly sounding album and one that still sounds human is optimal, okay? Because you can go too far with production, as we'll talk about in other episodes. So admittedly, this is a lot to ask, and probably explains why numerous albums are deemed not to be produced particularly well, right? I mean, let's think about it. For an album to be produced well in a conventional sense, we're saying, okay, it needs to be transparent. So there's lots of clarity. We can hear what's going on. There needs to be a nice balance in the tones, right? So that you got a pleasing sort of mixture of the low frequencies, mid ranges, and high frequencies. That you've got a nicely defined sound stage, right? That things are spread out. Again, important for clarity, really, right? But that you don't overdo it, that none of this is overproduced, that it doesn't sound human anymore. So again, that's actually hard to do. And actually, like I say, it explains why a lot of things are really not produced all that well, because this is actually, it's surprising to me how many albums don't check off all those boxes, right? And I think it speaks to the idea that production and producers, this is actually an art, right? That a lot of times they don't get it right, as we'll talk about here in just a second. So there are certain albums that have achieved widespread approval in terms of sound quality, by adhering closely to the aforementioned conventional production aesthetic. Again, so good transparency, good tone, soundstage, but not going too far. The following list identifies a few well-known works, many of which remain sonic benchmarks even by today's standards. So I've listed, again, it's subjective, but I'm pretty sure these 15 albums, almost everybody's going to agree sound good, or most people probably say sound really good. They're albums that are produced really well. I think they're benchmarks that have been used by subsequent artists as well to get an idea. Okay, this is how a good album should sound. And actually, it starts in the 70s, I think. I'm actually, it strikes me, back when Turner Overdrive's third album, Not Fragile, was produced, it's an album of 1974, but it still sounds great today. It's still a state-of-the-art production as far as I'm concerned. It checks off all those boxes, right? So does Nazareth's Hair of the Dog or Budgie's Bandolier. I mean, these are also 70s albums. UFO, knocked one out of the park with Lights Out in terms of production. Scorpions' Love Drive of 1979, right? I mean, all of these albums is kind of interesting because all of these bands were well into their careers once they finally hit on maybe their best produced album, right? Like BTO was their third album. Nazareth, Hair of the Dog was 6th album, 6th or 7th album. Bandolier was Budgie's 5th. UFO, Lights Out was the 6th studio album by UFO. Love Drive, was 7th, I believe, for Scorpions. So you sort of get my idea, right? That it took a while for bands to sort of reach the pinnacle of really good production, because most of the albums produced before these, a lot of them sound good, but they typically are a lot more raw, a lot more primitive. And also, I would argue in most cases, a lot of these bands didn't produce albums that sounded as good as these, right? So like I say, good production can be fleeting. That's why it's an art. Even established artists don't get it right all the time. And once they stumble upon it, sometimes have trouble repeating it, right? A few other things we'll say. So Judas Priest, British Steel, I think is an absolute standard in production. Rush's Moving Pictures would be another one. Judas Priest, British Steel. So again, we're not talking about performance and song quality here. All these albums, I mean, I think they have that too. Like me personally, I actually like, some of the earlier Judas Priest albums actually better in terms of songs. And I mean, same with the Scorpions. Earlier Scorpions I like better too. But there's no denying that British Steel just checked off all the boxes, right? It's a very warm sounding album, but still it didn't neuter the aggressiveness of Judas Priest. It kind of captured everything. So much so that I think British Steel became the template. Almost every other Priest album was, you could see there was an attempt to try to replicate the production of British Steel after that, right? It kind of set a template for the band. Rush's Moving Pictures is interesting too. Same deal. I think this is the pinnacle in sound for Rush. They had a lot of albums before Moving Pictures that actually were produced really well. But I think this is the climax of their production. And I think they actually go down after this. I mean, if you compare Moving Pictures to albums that came after, things like Signals and Grace Under Pressure and Power Windows and Hold Your Fire, I think those albums, again, performances are great, but in terms of sound, I think they sound too clinical. Like Moving Pictures to me sounds really human. Rush after that produced a lot of albums. It took quite a while before they started to sound kind of human again and not super sterile, right? I'd say, same with Iron Maiden. Peace of Mind was their 4th album. The 3 albums that came before were rawer, and they actually fit well for where the band was at. But Peace of Mind had this warmth to it, but still Maiden still sounded really aggressive on it. But there was great transparency, great soundstage, all that stuff. The tone was perfect, I thought. But then after that, Power Slave, Somewhere in Time, Seventh Son, I thought those albums, they really lacked in tone compared to Peace of Mind, right? I mean, they're very bass heavy. The later albums I'm talking about, the guitars sound really low in the mix to me. The band doesn't sound nearly as powerful. In fact, I would argue it took a lot of albums before Maiden got back to producing really good sounding albums. Not talking about the performances again, because I think they're always great in terms of performance, right? But I would say it kind of took to almost like Dance of Death or A Matter of Life and Death, like many decades later, before they stumbled upon a production approach that was as good as Peace of Mind. right? So again, it's fleeting. Let's just say it's an art, right? I'd say exactly the same for Accept. Albums before Balls to the Wall were great. The production actually sounded good, more raw. Balls to the Wall, though, was kind of perfect. Finally, it had that warmth, that really nice balance in tone and great soundstage that some of the other albums didn't have. But then after that, I mean, you had Metal Heart and Russian Roulette, which, again, I thought sounded kind of sterile by comparison, right? Metallica's Master of Puppets. I mean, I'll speed this up a bit because you kind of get the idea here. But this is the third album by Metallica. Again, I would argue Master of Puppets is hands down their best sounding album. I mean, the first two albums are terrific in terms of songs and performance, and the production is raw and it suits. But Master of Puppets, there's this warmth, and everything else is perfect. The tone, the soundstage, etc. And then after that, things get kind of weird for Metallica, I think. And Justice for All is maybe an overproduced album, and the bass just disappears. Now, some might argue the Black Album, the fifth album by Metallica, is their best sounding album. And I can understand why people would say that, because it does sound really good. But I think it's a little overproduced in the fact that it tended to take away some of Metallica's power on that album. And then later on, I mean, don't even get me started on Saint Anger. I have no idea what the band was doing in terms of sound, even though I do like the songs, right? But I think Master of Puppets was the perfectly produced thrash album, maybe the best sounding thrash album of all time in terms of sound, right? Soundgarden's Bad Motorfinger and Nirvana's Nevermind, two great examples of so-called grunge albums that I think are produced really, really well. Megadeth always produced really good albums, but I think Countdown to Extinction is their pinnacle of production. It's also their best selling, so not surprising. And again, don't forget how much Nevermind sold and Bad Motorfinger. I don't think that's a coincidence. They're also their best sounding albums. Pantera's Vulgar Display of Power, Sepultura's Chaos AD, very heavy, very aggressive albums, but produced so well that the balance is still there. The band's aggressiveness is not sacrificed in any way, but it's got a very conventional, orthodox production at the same time, right? So in addition to excellent songs and performances, I would argue that at least part of the reason that these 15 albums remain so highly celebrated by hard rock and metal fans, and maybe even some people outside of that, has to do with state-of-the-art yet very orthodox production, okay? Okay, just to wrap this up, in the past, it took considerable time in expensive studios with well-paid producers to achieve desired sounds, right? Today, with the use of software technologies such as Pro Tools and the ability to build personal recording studios at a fraction of previous costs, it's far easier to manufacture albums that sound good in a conventional sense, right? Yet there are several examples when heavy metal or hard rock albums do not achieve archetypical transparency, tone, and soundstage as we defined it above. So why is that? Well, this could be due to continuing resource restrictions. I mean, probably yes. I mean, yeah, you can build your own studio now, but it's still going to cost you quite a bit. It's just now that it's possible, whereas in the past it really wasn't. And it's still going to take a lot of time to produce a good album as well, right? So those could be restrictions that some bands don't have. Or more likely, it's just plain lack of expertise. And I would say that's the most likely reason why we still have albums that sound a little off, so to speak, and are not perfectly produced, at least in a conventional sense, right? Because as I was saying, it's an art. Good production just doesn't happen, right? Even those established bands we talked about don't get it right all the time. It took them a lot of years to get there. And then after that, they don't often repeat it, right? So production's a tough thing to achieve, okay? But having said that, all that said, in modern times, many alternative production outcomes are deliberate, right? And while not conventionally good, are completely appropriate to those in the know. So what I've described is the conventional or orthodox good production, but there are lots of examples of heavy metal and hard rock albums that don't deliberately try to sound raw, right? Or a little murky, etc. And that can be completely effective given what the band is trying to achieve. And we're going to talk about that in the next episode with reference to certain albums by Black Sabbath, especially Born Again, probably their most controversial album, and also pretty much the entire Dark Throne catalog adheres to that aesthetic too, that bad can be really good, all right? So hopefully you'll check that out. And in the meantime, Stay well, stay heavy, be cool.